I wonder if I could start by asking you about your experiences in Chernobyl, in terms of the kind of these whole chats are about abandoned places and perhaps Spartan dwellings, and I think Chernobyl in all of our imaginations is this abandoned zone. And I just wonder if you could talk to us a bit about your visits to that kind of that place.
Yeah. So the first thing that surprised me about Chernobyl is despite the continuing danger and contamination there, it is surprisingly easy to visit. Large areas of the zone are no longer considered to be particularly radioactive, and so you can apply quite easily for permission to visit. And when you arrive, you go through these sort of very Soviet era machines, and you're scanned for radiation. And then you drive in to the town of Pripyat, which was built as this kind of dormitory town for people working for the nuclear reactor. But generally, the exclusion zone is roughly the size of Cornwall. It contains two good-sized towns and about 200 smaller villages, which are very rural and quite traditional. And so the towns, because they're quite modern, they've been built in that very Soviet style. They're sort of concrete. The architecture is holding up quite well, but what you do find sort of walls will be buckling a little bit, and perhaps sort of roots are coming through beneath the plaster, that kind of thing. Or you might find birds nesting in fuse boxes. And walking through the streets of Pripyat, it's like stepping through a disaster movie. That's the closest reference point I had.
And a lot of the people I'm talking to for this series of films, we're talking about wild places which are, I suppose, savage in some way. So we're talking about cabins on the edge of something where the environment is not hospitable. But here we're almost talking about the opposite, aren't we? Where the environment is very livable, but there is this invisible force which has driven everything out. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the radioactivity as you experienced it there.
Yes, it is it's almost like a sort of thought experiment. You have to convince yourself of it, because of course you cannot see, smell, hear radiation. You can only navigate this sort of extra layer of existence through the medium of a Geiger counter. You can carry one around and it sort of crackles away the whole time. In certain areas, they call them hotspots locally, you come into an area where there's really a lot of radiation. There was a small hotspot I found where my interpreter said that it had been somewhere that people would kick the dust off their boots as they came back from the reactor during the disaster. And so this like radioactive dust they would track back with them, and then it's left a sort of trace into the presence, which I found very interesting.
And I suppose when you were there, if it's not an odd question, how did you feel? I mean, was it a sad place? Was it just strange?
It was quite an eerie experience. So certain parts of it are very beautiful, and the sort of physical degeneration of the place is fascinating. We go into the old sports center, one of the old sports centers, and find that the concrete shell of the building had survived perfectly well, but the huge windows had long shattered, and then that meant that the wooden floor had become very wet and sort of spongy with all these years of rain, and then silver birch were sort of popping up between the floorboards, and various species growing. So I mean, it's really an incredible scene to cast your eyes over. It's like something, and it's like a vision of the future. So there's that. Every time you go into large derelict buildings, you have to worry quite a lot about floorboards giving way, or there's lots of broken glass, lots of rusted metal, sheared off bits of beam. You do have to be sort of quite careful. And certainly while I was in the zone, in theory we weren't meant to be going into buildings, but there was very little oversight of that, and so people do, and I certainly did.